Okay, well, I might make a start. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what I know will be an incredible webinar. My name's Maria Demopoulos. I'm the CEO of the Settlement Council of Australia. Let me start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands upon which you're joining today. I want to pay my deepest respects to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who might be joining us online today. People working in settlement, we recognise that every journey of belonging takes place on the lands, stolen lands, unceded lands, and that our work carries a shared responsibility to continue to foster understanding and to promote the importance of truth-telling across our nation. Thank you, as I said, to all of you for joining us in this very important three-part webinar series on forced marriage, identification, response and support. Firstly, I'd like to, on behalf of the Settlement Council of Australia and our 180 members, I'd like to thank the presenters and partner organisations for their generosity and willingness to share their experience and insight. These conversations, in our view, are critical to ensuring that settlement workers are appropriately equipped with the kind of knowledge, confidence and networks that we know are needed to respond effectively and appropriately when these issues of concern arise. We also know that settlement workers are often the first trusted professionals that newly arrived communities, families and individuals encounter. Again, all of you around the virtual room know that it is the settlement sector who are at the front line of supporting people through their navigation process of new systems and connections in Australia. Forced marriage is a complex issue, but we also know it's an issue that intersects profoundly with migration. It requires thoughtful, informed, coordinated responses. I also want to say that it's very important that we reject any associated stereotypes or damaging narratives when we do have these kinds of conversations. We want to say very clearly that issues of forced marriage and anti-slavery are not associated with any particular group, any particular ethnicity or religion, that rather it's a human rights issue, first and foremost. It occurs in diverse settings across many, many different contexts, and just as importantly, requires responses that are grounded in evidence, cultural responsiveness, and partnerships with the relevant and appropriate agencies. So today's webinar is going to do exactly that, provide practical guidance around recognising indicators of forced marriage, responding safely to disclosures, and understanding the appropriate referral pathways and specialist supports that are available to us. Let me now introduce to you Elsie. Elsie's going to talk a little bit more, but she just explained to us that she has become, as of yesterday, Elsie, the Forced Marriage Project Coordinator. So I was going to read from your bio, but I do want to say that you've worked in numerous roles across the University of Technology of Sydney, including 2 years with the legal practice supporting survivors of modern slavery in Australia. I'm battling a cold, folks, so you'll have to forgive my voice coming in and out here. But Elsie, you've had a key role in establishing the National Partnership Against Modern Slavery, organising Australia's first national online conference on modern slavery, and as I say, more recently with the national project Speak Now. And Speak Now aims to prevent forced marriage and other forms of modern slavery in the home through education, awareness raising, collaboration. We can't thank you enough. We do see great value, and I think leading up to the webinar, we shared with you that increasingly our sector is identifying these sorts of issues and very much wanting to have these kinds of sessions. Sorry again. Over to you, Elsie. I'm going to stop speaking and preserve my voice for a little bit, but want to thank you and Anti-Slavery Australia for your generosity in helping us co-host these sessions. Thank you again, Elsie.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your very kind introduction. So hello, everyone. I'm Elsie. I'm from Anti-Slavery Australia. So just a bit of background about who we are. We are Australia's only specialist legal practice that focuses on modern slavery. So that includes all types of human trafficking, forced labor, servitude, and of course, forced marriage. And you might see on the screen there, we have our logo, My Blue Sky, which is our dedicated forced marriage service. So we'll talk a bit more about that later on. Um, Before we get started, or maybe while I'm doing the introduction, we do have a little live poll that we wanted to share in the chat. And this will help us understand your existing knowledge about forced marriage and also about our service. And it'll help us structure the content of this webinar and also the upcoming webinars as well next week and the week after. Before I jump into the content, I just wanted to flag that forced marriage is a form of modern slavery, and as a result of that, it can be a challenging and distressing issue. So if you do feel upset by any of the content today, please feel free to take a break at any time. You might also be able to access additional support through the EAP service in your organization or a similar external provider like Beyond Blue. So we'll just jump right in. So, what actually is the meaning of modern slavery? So, modern slavery is actually an umbrella term, and it covers the worst forms of human exploitation that we see today, as distinguished from historical forms of slavery, which were abolished in Australia, and also across the world in the 1800s. So, modern slavery covers a range of situations when someone's freedom is taken away, and this can happen through either coercion, threats, or deception. So these three terms are what's found in the legislation in Australia when we talk about modern slavery. Coercion essentially covers all forms of force, pressure, abuse, or control. It doesn't have to be physical force or violence. Oftentimes it is purely psychological pressure or emotional coercion. It can also be an abuse of power. So, for example, an Australian citizen who tries to convince a humanitarian entrant that they have less power in Australia or that they can get into trouble if they try to speak up about their situation or about the abuse that's happening. It can be also other forms of control, like controlling a person's passport or their other personal documents to the extent that the person feels like they can't actually seek help or to leave their situation. The second category, threats. So that covers threats against the person who's at risk of modern slavery or in modern slavery, but it also extends to threats against other people that they might care about. So especially for someone who has migrated to Australia, they might be threatened that their family back home might be at risk of harm if they try to leave their situation or if they try to report to the authorities. Finally, deception covers all forms of lies or trickery. So this is dishonest or misleading conduct that makes a person feel like they're not actually able to understand what's happening, or they may be consenting to a situation that might not actually exist. So this can be deception around the nature and conditions of a person's pay, about the conditions of their work, and also might extend to marriage as well, as we'll cover later on. So, as Maria mentioned, modern slavery is a breach of human rights and it's against the law in Australia. So, as we'll see on this slide, we have 8 different types of modern slavery, and all of these are considered federal crimes under the Criminal Code, the Commonwealth Criminal Code. So, I might just go through these briefly so you have an understanding of what these terms actually mean. So, the first type of modern slavery is human trafficking, and that's probably one that we've all heard of. So, human trafficking looks at how a person is taken into, out of, or within a country across borders. So, a person can be trafficked into Australia, they can be trafficked out of Australia, which is called exit trafficking, and is actually on the rise in Australia from the reports we receive. But there can also be domestic trafficking, which is where a person is trafficked across state or territory borders. So here we're looking at whether that person consented to the travel. So this is where it's different from other issues like people smuggling, where the person may have consented to the travel, but then the mode of travel itself might be illegal. So with human trafficking, we're looking at whether the person was coerced, threatened, or deceived into being transported across the border. The second type is slavery. So this is essentially where a person is treated like an object. They're potentially being bought, sold, traded, and treated as less than human or as a commodity. The third type is forced labor. So that is where a person doesn't feel free to stop working or to leave their place of work. And here we're not just talking about being physically constrained or being physically trapped in that workplace. We're also looking at whether they feel potentially psychologically pressured to remain in that situation to to the extent where even though they physically can leave, they feel like they're not able to without some sort of endangerment to themselves or to others they care about. That's very closely related to the fourth type, which is servitude. So this is where a person doesn't feel free to stop working or to leave their workplace. But in addition to that, they're also deprived of their personal freedoms in other aspects of their lives. So for example, they might be controlled as to when they can eat, sleep, or shower. They might not be able to communicate with third parties, use the internet or a mobile phone, and they might not be able to even leave the house by themselves or to actually travel between their workplace and their home without a chaperone or without a third party controlling their movements. The fourth type is debt bondage. So this is where a person is essentially trapped in a debt that they can't pay off, either because the amount of the debt is excessive or because their labor or their services aren't actually being used to pay off the debt. So we see this happening a lot where potentially an employer or a member of a household tries to facilitate a person's travel to Australia. And then when that person arrives, they tell the person that they need to pay, tens of thousands of dollars back for the cost of their visa, the cost of their flights, and also for their accommodation in Australia. So in those cases, that person is financially being trapped rather than necessarily being physically trapped. The sixth type is deceptive recruitment for labor or services. So this is where a person is being recruited for a job, but then they're being misled about the conditions and nature of their work. So they might not be told that they will owe a debt when they arrive or when they start working. They might not be told that they will be exploited or have their personal documents taken away, or they might be misled about the nature of that work. So not being told that the services they provide will be sexual in nature, for example. The seventh type is forced marriage, which we'll touch on later on. And finally, the eighth type is the worst forms of child labor. So these cover a range of situations where a child is engaged in either illegal or hazardous work. So that can include child forced labor, it can include child sexual exploitation, or working in dangerous industries like mining, for example. So what's interesting about the picture of modern slavery in Australia is that the most common form is actually forced marriage. So usually we hear in the news that modern slavery can be human trafficking or it can be forced labor. It can happen, on farms, on construction sites. But many people don't realize that forced marriage is actually the most common type reported to the police. Um, and historically, we see that this can be potentially because many people don't realize that forced marriage is even a crime, let alone a form of modern slavery. There is often this misconception within the community that forced marriage is a private family issue that can't be discussed in the public realm, that it can't be disclosed to your service. And that's one of the misconceptions that we really want to address through our awareness raising with clients and also with communities, is to actually flag that this is actually a very prominent issue and that people can access help for it. So what actually is forced marriage? Forced marriage is any marriage that occurs basically without free and full consent from both parties. So when we use the term marriage here, it covers all forms of marriages. So that can cover cultural marriages, religious marriages, registered de facto relationships, and also marriages that aren't otherwise legally valid in Australia. For example, polygamous marriages or marriages between siblings. So the key takeaway here is that essentially a person does have rights around forced marriage, even if the marriage that they're in isn't legally registered or valid um, in that legal sense in Australia. So forced marriage can happen in one of three ways. So the first way is where that person is coerced, threatened, or deceived into the marriage. Again, this doesn't have to be through physical violence. A person can be threatened that if they don't get married, their younger sibling would have to take their place, or they might be coerced into believing that if they don't get married, they would be disowned or ostracized from their family or their community. They can also be deceived in quite subtle ways. So sometimes a person might turn up to a family gathering believing it's just a party or a way to visit relatives, but then when they arrive, they realize it's actually a wedding ceremony and they had no knowledge of that prior to the event. We also see commonly an intersection between forced marriage and trafficking out of Australia to get married. So this can happen where a person is being told that they're going on a family trip or a holiday to visit relatives, but then when they arrive overseas, they realize they're actually being forced to marry someone they've never met before. So that's a very common scenario that we see through the Australian reports. So the second way that forced marriage can happen is where a person doesn't actually understand the nature and effect of a marriage ceremony. So this is a legalistic way of saying that person doesn't know what they're actually signing up for when they get married. They might have an intellectual disability or be too young to actually understand their rights and obligations when it comes to marriage. And in that way, they're not actually able to consent to the marriage. Finally, there is a blanket rule that if a person is under 16, so if they are 15 or younger, when they get married, then that would always be a forced marriage, regardless of whether they consented or not. So a young person who is 15 or under can say that they want to get married, that they consent to it, but regardless of that verbal consent, the law doesn't take that as valid, and they're actually considered too young to get married at all. So as Maria mentioned as well, forced marriage can happen to anyone. It's not associated with any particular religion, culture, or ethnic background. We do see from our cases that it can happen to people from very highly educated backgrounds, from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds as well. But we do see that some groups are more at risk. So the majority of reports we receive in Australia and also across the world do involve women and young girls. Um, I would say around half of the reports from what we see from the Australian Federal Police involve people under 18. So it is an issue that disproportionately affects young people. We see forced marriage happening to people from very different visa types and also residency statuses. And actually, most of the reports to the police involve citizens or permanent residents. And this, of course, can include people from originally refugee backgrounds who are now able to um, stay and live in Australia permanently. And sometimes that can be a risk factor because they're then able to sponsor the visa of someone who's offshore. So that incentive of being able to sponsor a partner visa can sometimes lead to a citizen or a permanent resident being more vulnerable to forced marriage. We also see forced marriage happening to people who identify as LGBTIQ+. So unfortunately, in these cases, forced marriage is seen as a way to conceal or to so-called normalize behaviors or identities that are seen as unacceptable, particularly within very conservative communities. People with disability can also be at risk. So again, this can be because they don't have the mental capacity to consent, but also oftentimes we see people with disabilities being forced to marry so that they have a spouse or a caretaker for them, and so that they have the opportunity to experience a normal family life. Um, so we see that parents and guardians in this context can oftentimes force a marriage out of a misguided place of love and out of a sense that this is actually what's best for that person. Um, so in those cases, it can be quite nuanced and complex to respond to. Finally, forced marriage does commonly happen to people from very socially conservative backgrounds. So these are families and communities characterized by very rigid gender norms, potentially patriarchal values, where the male family members make all the decisions. And also, they tend to prioritize the group's well-being and the group's interests over an individual's choice. So you might hear things like we see on this slide, where a young person especially might be hearing pressures and comments from everyone around them, from their immediate family, from their extended family, saying that we're counting on you to make the right choice. This is what's best for everyone. Don't embarrass your family. So a lot of those considerations might seem quite innocent on the surface. These are comments that we might have even heard in our own personal lives. But over time, as this pressure builds, it can become so overwhelming that a person feels like they're not actually able to consent. So that leads to the situation on the right-hand side there, where this is actually a woman we interviewed as part of our research. She explained that they make it in a way where you have the option, but you don't have the option. At the end of the day, you can't say no. So essentially, this describes a situation where there are no explicit threats or physical violence happening, but there is this implicit expectation that you will go through with this marriage and you will do what's best for everyone in the community and in the family, and that you're expected to do this and to prioritize their needs above your own individual wishes in that context. So it's really interesting and important to look at what drives this pressure to force a person into marriage, simply because it helps us better identify certain families or certain people who might be more at risk. So one of the key drivers is a person might actually just want what's best for their child and to actually ensure their child's future, especially if they came from a refugee background where they might be experiencing financial hardship, visa instability, financial insecurity. In those cases, a marriage can be the only way for their child to secure a more stable future. And it comes from, again, that genuine place of love and care for that person, even though it is misguided and even though it is against the law and it deprives that person of their rights to choose. Another driver is a person might want to strengthen a person's connection to their community or culture, and it may be a way of following or preserving tradition, especially when they've moved from another country where there might be that cultural loss. Forced marriage can be considered an intergenerational practice, and it's a way of keeping a tradition alive in a new setting, for example, in Australia. Forced marriage might also be a way of meeting community expectations and maintaining a family's reputation. So we see here oftentimes the parents themselves are also victims of pressure. It's not just the young person or the person being forced to marry who's um, actually experiencing pressure. It's also the facilitators who feel like they are obliged to follow through with a forced marriage practice as a way of meeting expectations within the community, because they might also be at risk of having their reputation damaged or being ostracized or marginalized themselves if they don't go through with that practice. Forced marriage can also be a way of keeping or restoring honor, especially if a person has behaved in a way that's seen as shameful. So this might be because, as I've mentioned before, they're LGBTIQ+, or potentially they're dating someone who's not approved of by the family, and as a result, the forced marriage is being used as a tool to conceal that and to restore honor that's seen as having been lost. So forced marriage might also be a way of following really rigid gender norms. So these are strict ideals about how men and women are supposed to behave and what they're supposed to do at certain stages of their life. So, especially for women, there can be this perception that she needs a man to take care of her, and that at a certain age, she needs to be married and to become a mother and a wife. So, in those cases, forced marriage can be used as a way to ensure those pathways happen and those timings happen as well. So this next one is particularly relevant for settlement services. So forced marriage can be a way of helping people seek safety or a better life in Australia. So again, where a spouse is able to have their visa sponsored by a partner, this can be a way of ensuring they can actually travel to live and also work in Australia and to escape potentially poverty and conflict back home. So in those cases, it can be quite challenging to respond to those because you're juggling a person's desire to help their family, to help their extended community, versus sometimes what's perceived as that selfish choice of not wanting to get married. So that can be quite culturally nuanced, and it requires a really sensitive understanding of the different considerations at play for us to actually be able to help people in those situations. Finally, a forced marriage can be a way of keeping wealth within the family or a way of keeping property within the family and also avoiding poverty or financial insecurity. So again, going back to that idea of marrying someone who's from a wealthier family or someone who's more financially secure can be a very strong incentive for a forced marriage. So this is a very common question is what is the difference between arranged marriage and a forced marriage? On paper, there are quite clear distinctions. So if an arranged marriage is widely practiced and it's completely lawful in Australia and also across the world. It happens where a couple is introduced by their family or by a third party, for example, a matchmaker, but ultimately each person can freely accept or reject the arrangement at any time. And the key here is that they have free consent so that they can change their mind without fearing something bad will happen, without being afraid that there will be negative consequences. So ideally, that person might initially agree to the marriage, but then later on, if they do change their minds, they can back out without fearing that they will bring shame or dishonor to their family or to themselves. Um, in contrast, forced marriage is unlawful, as we've mentioned, and that happens where that couple is pressured or deceived by others to the extent where they feel like they can't freely accept or reject the marriage. So we're looking at whether that coercion and that pressure has risen to such an extent that they feel like their choice has been taken away. So they feel like they are unable to say no anymore, and they feel like the only option is to follow through, even if there's been no explicit threats posed against them. But in reality, it can be quite tricky to distinguish between a consensual marriage and a forced marriage, which is highlighted by this case study here. So this is Anna's story, which I'll read out very quickly. So Anna and her family came to Australia to escape conflict in their home country, leaving many family and community members behind. As Anna makes new friends in Australia and starts spending more time away from her community, her parents become concerned that she's abandoning her culture and becoming too westernized. One day, they tell Anna that they have some exciting news. They found a man from their community back home who has agreed to marry her. Anna is shocked because she's never met this man before and has never had any serious conversations with her parents about marriage. News about Anna's engagement spreads quickly throughout her community in Australia and also overseas. Everyone congratulates Anna, telling her that this is a good match and she should be happy. Anna tells her parents she doesn't want to get married, but her parents get upset at her and tell her she's being selfish and ungrateful. Anna feels guilty for wanting to back out and is afraid of losing her family if she doesn't agree to the marriage. So unfortunately, this is quite a common case study that we see, and it's inspired by real stories that we've seen in our casework. But it also highlights how subtle the coercion can be. So here, there has been no violence, no abuse, no threats. The marriage happened from quite a genuine place of wanting to preserve Anna's connection to her culture, and also it's considered a good match by everyone in the community. So actually, this can be quite overwhelming for someone who's in Anna's situation, who feels quite isolated and alone in how she feels, but at the same time feels guilty for wanting something different for herself, contrary to what her family wants. So what's really important here is to know that even though there is that difference between arranged marriages, consensual marriages versus forced marriages, in reality, it can be this gray area where we're not really sure whether that person has consented. And even for someone like Anna, she might not even know what she wants and what consent would look like for her. The good news is that it's not our job to diagnose the issue or whether it is a forced marriage. As long as there are those key red flags or signs of force or pressure, that's enough for us to intervene and to at least inform the person of their rights and also their support options, and to make sure that they know that there are services available who can help them navigate those situations. So in those cases, it's not our job to stop a marriage from happening, to necessarily try to again diagnose whether it is a form of modern slavery. It's enough for us to just spot the red flags and to connect that person with support. Okay, so now we'll move on to looking at what actually are those signs and indicators. So on this screen, we have some specific indicators that do often point to forced marriage. One of the key ones is a person's older siblings or other family members might have been forced to marry previously. So again, forced marriage often is an intergenerational practice where the parents might have been forced to marry themselves, and then when they have children and those children grow up, they then pass on that practice to their children. So if we do notice in a community or in a particular family that there are those incidences of forced marriage, that can be an indicator that the younger members of that unit can be at risk in the future. Also, if the engagement or the marriage is somehow sudden or unexpected, that can indicate that there wasn't actually the time or opportunity for the person to understand what's happening or for them to express their true wishes. So in those cases, that arrangement can sometimes be forced, or there might also be deception at play as well. Similarly, if a person is getting married to someone they don't know, that's a very clear sign that they probably didn't have the time to consent to the marriage. They can't actually consent to a marriage if they don't know who they're marrying. And also can point to the fact that they weren't actually involved in making plans for that marriage themselves. So again, because forced marriage often does happen overseas, if there is an upcoming overseas trip that raises concerns, so if a person feels anxious about a trip overseas, or if they do go overseas and they fail to return, sometimes that can indicate that a forced marriage has taken place overseas. And a lot of times that person can be stuck overseas in that other country, or they might actually return after a few years. So if you do notice there is that risk of travel, it's really important to seek help as soon as possible. The next one is actually really interesting. So being young and wearing a ring or expensive jewelry was actually something that a school teacher flagged in one of our interviews. So as part of our research, we tried to understand how different indicators can present in different settings. And for those working with young people, they mentioned that sometimes if you notice a young person wearing quite expensive jewelry, that can be an indicator that gifts were exchanged leading up to or during that marriage arrangement. And it can also be a really useful conversation starter if you're not sure how to approach the issue or the topic of forced marriage, is you can simply ask, oh, where did you get that ring from? Or that's a really beautiful piece of jewelry. Where did you get that from? That can really help open up a conversation in a more friendly way without having to outright ask about elements of coercion or pressure in that person's life. Finally, if a person feels helpless, anxious, or like they don't have a choice, particularly around that marriage or around other decisions in their lives, that can indicate that the marriage itself is being forced and that they're not actually free to express their own full and free consent. There are also some general indicators that are really important to look out for. So these are signs that can overlap with other forms of abuse or violence. Many of these are similar to coercive control and also domestic and family violence and potentially child abuse as well. So these aren't necessarily specific to forced marriage, but they can help us identify issues that might be happening, or it can help lead us to identifying a forced marriage situation. So one of the key indicators is that person might become more absent or perform more poorly, either at work or in their studies. That's not always the case, of course. Sometimes a person can actually perform better at work or in their studies simply because they feel motivated to become financially independent or to pursue their own paths when they are facing that risk of a forced marriage. So we're really looking at whether there are any changes or unusual behavior that that person might present with. A person can also experience increased mental health difficulties or changes in their mood or behavior. So we see in our clients, it's quite common for a person to experience anxiety, depression, or PTSD in association with forced marriage. There is also that intersection between forced marriage and reproductive coercion. So a person might be forced into an early or unwanted pregnancy or abortion. And typically we see this happening with young women who marry into a very conservative family, they essentially lose their bodily autonomy and their right to have control over their own sexual health. So in a health setting, that can be a really useful indicator. A person might also be more socially withdrawn or isolated, so they might be controlled about who they can speak with, who they can spend time with. They might be spending less time with their friends and more time with a pre-approved circle of people within the community. They can also be chaperoned or monitored by their family or their community members. So we might see that, they might still be attending their appointments, they might still be attending events in the community, but between those engagements, they're being accompanied by an older brother or by their father, or they're having their movements monitored. So they might have a curfew, for example, on their movements. That person might also be restricted in terms of their ability to use phones or internet. So this can make it really difficult for them to access information about their rights and their supports, and also for service providers to actually communicate with them. So in those cases, it's really important to ascertain safe and confidential ways to communicate with clients, and also potentially understanding safe times for us to actually reach out, and certain modes might also be more appropriate than others. So a person might also feel pressure to adhere to strict rules, traditions, or cultural norms outside of marriage. So this might be norms around how they dress, how they behave, what they're able to even, study or do with their lives. So we're looking at whether there are those wider forms of control over a person's life beyond just marriage decision making, and this can indicate that potentially there might also be elements of control over their choices around marriage as well. So that ties into the next indicator, which is a person might have their family or their community members control their other life choices. So this might be their career aspirations, whether they can stay in school, or whether they can pursue higher education at uni. And overall, we sense that a person does feel quite hopeless or helpless about their future. So when a person is being controlled over their life choices or about their life path, they can feel like they aren't able to actually realize their own dreams and aspirations, that no one is actually listening to what they want or what they need. Sometimes a person might be forced to give up their career goals or be forced to drop out of school in order to get married. So overall, we want to get a sense of whether that person, um, or how that person feels about their life in general, and whether that can indicate potentially coercion in the marriage sphere as well. So let's say that you've identified some of the signs and risk factors for forced marriage, and you want to open up a conversation with that person. We have some tips here for how we can do that safely and appropriately. So I'm sure that you're all familiar with this in your own existing practices, but these are some specific contextual tips that we've developed. So the first tip is to, of course, build trust and show that you're a safe person to talk to about the issue. And when we talk about trust here and also safety, we're not just talking about physical or emotional safety. We also want to focus on cultural safety as well. So here it's really important to be non-judgmental and to respect that person's values, their choices, and their strengths. So of course, understanding why a person might want to follow through with their family's wishes, understanding why they might um, be hesitant to speak up against their family. It's really important here to protect that person's confidentiality. So understanding that we can't simply trust a third party just because they're a family member, because that family member might actually be complicit or be actually facilitating the forced marriage. And it's really important here to take the person's concerns seriously and also follow through where appropriate. And that, of course, shows that you are actually believing the person and you actually want to help them appropriately. So the second tip is to be led by how the person describes their own experiences. This is because many people don't actually identify with the term forced marriage or with the term slavery. They might find these quite confronting or unrelatable simply because the idea of them being a victim or their parents being a criminal can be quite alienating. So it's really important to use more familiar terms like pressures to marry, expectations to marry. Sometimes a person might even use the term arranged marriage to describe what's happening, even though when we look deeper, there are those elements of coercion there. But essentially mirroring the language and the terms that that person uses can help them open up more and also start a more productive conversation with them. So the third tip is, of course, to be culturally sensitive and aware of unconscious biases, both in your personal interactions with a client or with a member of the community, but also within your broader organization. So it's really important to avoid, or even better yet, challenge some of the most common misconceptions and stereotypes around forced marriage. So one of them might be questioning why a person doesn't just stand up to their family. So this is quite similar to, for example, in a DV space, questioning why a person doesn't leave or why they stay in a relationship. Um, in a forced marriage context, a person might not actually be able to safely speak up. They might not actually have the opportunity to express their wishes with their family. So it's really important not to question why a person has made certain choices or why they have certain values or beliefs. And um, it's better to come to those understandings from a place of curiosity and genuine desire to actually understand why a person is the way they are or why they made certain choices rather than judging those. There can sometimes also be this moral judgment that a love marriage is somehow better or more valid than an arranged marriage. So it's really important to avoid making comments like you should marry someone you love or you shouldn't go through with this marriage if you don't love the person, because implicitly we're implying that this Western idea of a love marriage is somehow better or it's somehow more consensual. But of course, that's not the case because arranged marriages can be quite successful, and as long as there is consent present, they are equally as valid. Finally, just being careful about the terminology we use. So instead of calling, for example, a marriage practice outdated or archaic, we should instead use more neutral language like traditional, just to avoid making any value judgments about why a certain practice is the way it is. We also have a list of questions here that can help you explore the risk of a forced marriage. So these start off with quite general questions like, what does a usual day look like for you? Which can help us paint a picture of whether there are those signs of control in a person's life. Um, and these gradually become more specific and potentially more uh, sort of indicative of whether there can be forced marriage as well. So another question that is still more general, but a bit more specific is asking how is marriage talked about in your family? You know, who makes the decisions? And if you're unhappy with a decision, what do you feel like you could do? Also asking more general questions about choice and consents. So understanding what does choice mean or look like to you can help us paint a picture of does that person actually have the ability to exercise choice and to express their consent in their family or in that situation. Also asking more questions around expectations of pressure. So do you feel like there are expectations of pressure for you to get married? Can help us pinpoint whether there are those elements of coercion, threats, or deception. And really importantly as well, understanding any safety risks. So if that person refused to get married or if they refuse to travel overseas, what are they concerned will happen? And do they believe their safety or their loved one's safety would be at risk in any way? So these questions aren't a formal risk assessment, but they can be very useful in terms of opening up a conversation and also exploring how risky it is that they could be facing a forced marriage. And we have a full list of those included in our Frontline Worker Guide online, which I'll share a link to maybe in a follow-up email. So let's say that you do identify that risk of a forced marriage. Your priority is always to ensure your safety and also that person's safety. So we advise you not to intervene or not to mediate in that situation, simply because it is quite a sensitive and complex situation. And even if you do have skills in mediation, in a family or domestic violence context, those might not actually transfer to a forced marriage context. So for the sake of your safety and for the sake of avoiding any backlash against you from the community, it's really important not to directly intervene in a forced marriage situation. However, it is really important to assess how serious and urgent that situation is. And to do that, we've established an acronym called STAT. So the first S stands for safety, which is essentially assessing whether that person is safe and does feel safe. So we want to look at whether there have been any changes recently as well, and whether there have been any escalations of threats or violence to help us understand the picture of risk here. The T stands for timing. So when is the marriage expected to happen? If we don't have any specific dates, it's really important to understand how far along that marriage planning has taken place. So understanding, has the dress been bought? Have the plane tickets been booked? If there are visa considerations, are there any visa expiry dates that we need to be aware of? It's really important to understand how urgently we need to respond in those situations. So A here stands for age, so understanding how old the person is. So as we mentioned before, if that person is under 16, then there's no question of consent. That is always a forced marriage. Similarly, if a person is under 18, then that might trigger mandatory reporting obligations. And also, it can also open up potentially other support options through the family court that aren't available for people over 18. So it's really important to know how old the person is. And finally, the last T stands for travel. So if there is travel being planned, where and when is that taking place? So depending on the country or the destination country that the person is traveling to, this can make it quite difficult for us to intervene and even for the police or the Australian government to intervene if that person is taken offshore. So, in some countries, for a young woman, she might not be able to leave the house by herself. She might not even be able to travel outside of the country without the permission of a male relative. So, if there is that risk of travel, it's really important to seek advice as soon as possible and to ensure that person is connected with support before they leave the country. Because once they leave, due to communication issues and jurisdictional issues, it can be quite challenging for us to actually provide support. So as the first point of contact, here are some steps you can use to provide some initial support. The first step is to reassure the person and to validate their experience. And this is particularly important because they might be hearing from everyone around them that this marriage is the right thing to do and that this is what's best for everyone. So having a service provider, someone from the outside who can validate what they're feeling and reassure that they're not alone, can be quite powerful. The second step is to inform the person of their rights and the different support options available. So, educating the person about the fact that in Australia, they have the right to choose when they get married or if they get married, and that regardless of what visa status they have, they can access free and confidential support. Um, and even that realization can be quite life-changing because, again, they feel trapped in the situation. They feel like they have no other choice. But then when we present that additional choice, that can really help open the doors for that person. Finally, if that person does wish to seek additional special support, it's really helpful to make referrals for them as appropriate, but always with informed consent. So here, of course, we can't force the person to seek support. We can't force them to see a lawyer. It's really important to always get that person's informed consent before we reach out to third parties. This is, of course, a safety consideration, and also it's also a way for us to give back the choice and the agency that's been taken away from that person. So this is just modeling what healthy communication should really look like, and it might actually be the first time that that person has experienced the ability to choose and to consent. So it's really important to provide that environment for the clients. So having said that, we need to keep in mind that a person does face a few important barriers to actually seeking and accessing supports. So that person might be living with and dependent on those forcing them into the marriage. This can make it really difficult for them to leave the house by themselves or to communicate with an external service. So that's really important to keep in mind when we do try to establish contact with a client. A person might also be afraid of engaging with authority figures, so that might be lawyers, it can be the police, it can also be home affairs. So, and this is because they might be afraid of getting their loved ones in trouble by seeking support. So oftentimes we see clients making this trade-off where they believe that they either have to stay with the marriage, um, or they might actually lose everyone they love and actually get the people they love most in trouble with the police or with immigration. So it's really important to reassure people in those situations that everything they say is confidential and that they aren't required to actually engage with the police in order to seek support. So I'll go through that in more detail here. So here we have some of the key referral options for modern slavery and forced marriage in particular. So one of the referral options is our organisation, Anti-Slavery Australia. We have a dedicated forced marriage service called My Blue Sky. What we do is we provide free and confidential legal and migration assistance. So this can be assistance with visas or citizenship. It can help. It can include helping a person get onto their own visa or to remain on their visa, even though there has been that sponsorship from a partner. We can also help with other issues like divorces, victims' compensation, applying for apprehended violence orders or other court orders as well. And if there is support that a person needs that is non-legal, we can also refer them to other types of supports, which I'll cover on the next slide. So with our organization, we do provide services on an ongoing basis. So once a person becomes a client, they remain a client for as long as needed. And also there's no requirement for them to engage with the police. However, if that person does wish to report to the police, the best contact would be the Australian Federal Police. So they're the agency responsible for investigating and also protecting people experiencing all forms of modern slavery, including forced marriage. One of the key benefits of engaging with the AFP is that they can support people who are at risk of being taken out of Australia. So one thing they can do is place a border alert on a person's passport so that if they do reach the airport, they're flagged and then taken aside to speak with an official in private. At that point, the police or the official doesn't have the power to stop the person from traveling, so they do still have that choice to board the plane. But essentially, it's that last resort opportunity to get that person aside from their family and to allow them to express that they don't wish to travel, and for them to then be connected with support at that point. I just want to flag that our organization and the AAP aren't considered emergency services. So if there is that imminent danger or a risk of harm to a person, or if a child is involved, it's really important to contact 000 in the first instance and to not wait for a response from either us or the AAP. We also have some national support programs that are funded by the government. So these provide free tailored support for people affected by all forms of modern slavery, and it can cover supports like casework support, accommodation, financial assistance, or being connected with other services like healthcare or counseling. The key program here is the first one, which is the Forced Marriage Specialist Support Program, or the FMSSP. So this is delivered nationally by Life Without Barriers, and it's for anyone who is either at risk of or who have already experienced forced marriage. The benefit of this program is that anyone can make a referral. You don't have to engage with the police or with the government, and you stay on that program for as long as needed. The second option is the Support for Trafficked People program, which is delivered nationally by Australian Red Cross. So this is now only available to people who've experienced other types of modern slavery apart from forced marriage. However, if a person has experienced forced marriage as well as another type of modern slavery, they can potentially be able to access either program. The key thing to note here is that it is a time limited program. So after a certain point, that person does have to decide whether they do want to engage with the police or not. And if they don't wish to engage with the police, they would then be exited from the program. And also, the only way for a person to be referred to the SDPP is through either the AFP, the police, or through the additional referral pathway. So the additional referral pathway, or the ARP, is led by the Salvation Army, and it's also delivered alongside us at Anti-Slavery Australia. So what this does is it provides immediate support for the person who's in a situation of modern slavery. We screen for indicators of slavery, and then if we do find that the person has experienced forced marriage or another form of modern slavery, we can refer them to the SCPP. So this bypasses the AFP and ensures that the person can still access support without having to engage with the police if they're afraid of doing that. So I'll just use the last few minutes to cover some of the resources available if you'd like to learn more after today's session. So our website, mybluesky.org.au, is available for free. We have all of our resources on there about forced marriage. We have dedicated pages for people who are being forced to marry, even friends and family members of people in a forced marriage, and also for frontline workers. We have a live chat where you can speak with one of our lawyers during business hours, and also a translation feature available in 26 different languages. We also have free resources. So these are flyers, posters, and business cards, again, translated into many different languages that we can provide to you for free. So if you are interested in having digital or printed copies, feel free to email us at that email address and we can send those to you. And this is available to anyone in Australia who's a frontline worker. Finally, I just wanted to flag that we do have an opportunity to engage with us if you are interested. So if you would like to speak with your client base or your community about the issue of forced marriage, we can actually provide you with free training and resources to either run a workshop or to co-deliver a workshop with us for a local community. So what we'll do is we'll be responsive to your needs and also your community's needs, and we'll restructure the content so that it's more focused on what the community needs to know. So looking at their rights in Australia, their support options, some of the underlying drivers of forced marriage, and also some healthy communication models as well that we can use with the community. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the webinar today. We have our contact details on the right-hand side there, and also we have a QR code on the left, and that takes you to an anonymous feedback survey. We'll love to get your feedback on today's session and the content we covered, just because we are running 2 other webinars, so it'll be great to know what's useful for you and how we can make the remaining 2 webinars better. So thank you so much.
So Elsie, if there are any questions beyond today, is there a way that people can reach out to you?
Yes. So if you use the email address on the screen there, asaresearch@uts.edu.au, that will go to me and my team at ASA, and we'll be happy to answer your questions.
And there's been some questions I noticed about the availability of the slides. Is that something you're happy to share?
I don't think we typically share the slides, but I can maybe share a written summary of the content and also links to the resources I mentioned.
Yeah, that's great. Terrific. Look, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for your presentation. As you said, we have 2 more to come, hoping that people will join us for the next 2. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. We hope that you found it useful. Please, can I also encourage you to provide any feedback, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Elsie, thank you again. Terrific.
Thank you so much for joining, everyone.
Go well, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.